still have enough.
I had to update my app before I could do it too. So I don't know, it slowed me down just a minute, but.
Yeah, there was a larger Zoom update in the last few weeks. So that's
Okay. We still have enough.
I had to update my app.
So if you want to start, I've started the live stream on YouTube and the other recordings. So
Well, I've got a couple of minutes after 7, so let's get rolling.
All right, let's do.
We can't wait forever. This is an official meeting. I'd like to welcome everybody out to Planning Commission on the 3rd of June. This is an electronic meeting, is being recorded that way. Have we had anybody put in for the hearing from public comment on the 3 subject matters?
no, I just checked the email account and nothing has come in.
All right, that'll solve a little bit of our hearing. We'll still hold the hearings, but there's no comments, so that'll speed it along. So let's get started with the hearing, review, and action on the preliminary plan and final plat for Mitchell Farms, Plat C, located in the area of 780 West, 800 North in the R1 12,000 residential zone. Adam, lead us on that one, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This first item, it's being processed as a combined preliminary and final. The reason for that is the original preliminary, which was approved in 2017, has expired, but this Plat C conforms to the original preliminary plan, and it's the same as the original. This is just another final plat in the Mitchell Farms subdivision. It's just located around just east of 9th West, and then about 780 to 800 North. It's just another phase in that overall development. So all the lots meet the requirements of the zone. Again, it's in compliance with the original preliminary, and we would recommend approval.
How many plats do we expect when this is finished out?
I think 1 or 2 more. I think the original called for maybe 4 or 5 phases. So this is definitely over half of the subdivision with this one.
And that's what I was thinking, is they're building up there like crazy. I just come by there earlier today and they're building all over the place. So we're moving right along, it looks like.
Yeah.
All right. Any questions or comments for planning from the commissioners? Engineering, Ben, would you like to comment on this one, please?
Yeah, this one's fairly straightforward. It meets all the local minimum road requirements. They're transitioning, like on some of the roads into existing improvements. They're transitioning from current standards into what's existing out there. So everything meets standards and meets what the requirements are, and we recommend it.
All right. This one calls for a hearing. We'll open the meeting for a public hearing, but I understand there's no comments at this time. So in that case, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing on this one. Do I have a motion from someone on Mitchell Farms Plat C, final or preliminary plan and final plat?
This is Ryan. I move to approve.
I have a motion by Ryan. Do I have a second?
Second, Chris.
Chris is a second. All right, thank you. Any further comments on this motion or this project? If not, we'll do a roll call vote. Christine, are you here yet?
Yes, she is.
Christine, are you going to vote?
I think her sound isn't working for some reason.
It's showing as muted.
Yeah, but it wasn't.
Oh, there we go.
Now it's. Try again, Christine. It's just a little quiet.
All right. Rod?
Yes, aye.
Chris?
Aye.
Harold?
Aye.
And Ryan?
Aye.
The chairman votes aye also, so it is unanimous. Motion passes. Moving on, hearing, review, and action on the preliminary plan and final plat for Peak Meadows Plat A in the area of 1200 East and 300 North in the R1 9000 residential zone. Adam, would you lead us on this one again, please?
Before we start, was there a motion also on the final plat, or was that just the preliminary?
Well, it's all lumped together on the, it says, in the motion, or the item on the agenda just says, hearing action review on the preliminary plan and final plat. So
Yes, I had prepared two motions, one for the preliminary, since that's one that you approve, and then the final gets recommended onto council. So it might be advisable just to make a recommendation on the final plat and move that one forward as well.
All right, we'll take a motion on the final plat then on this one.
This is
Mr.
Ryan.
Chairman,
Oh, go ahead.
Chairman, I move that we recommend approval of the final plat with the findings listed in the staff report and subject to any findings, conditions, and modifications found in the engineering report. This is Chris.
That was Chris, all right. I have a motion from Chris. Do I have a second?
Ryan, second.
Ryan seconded, all right. Any further comments on the final plat? Hearing none, we'll take a roll call vote. Christine?
Aye.
Rod?
Aye.
Chris?
Aye.
Harold?
Aye.
And Ryan?
Aye.
And the chairman votes aye also. It passes unanimously on both the preliminary and the final plat. Thanks, Adam, for keeping us straight.
No
Moving
problem.
on. We have hearing, review, and action on the preliminary plan and the final plat for Peak Meadows, Plat A, located in the area of 1200 East, 300 North, in the R1 9000 residential zone. Adam, would you lead us in this one, please?
Yeah, so this is just on the north side of 300 North, north of the hospital area at about 1200 East. This property came forward for a zone change in November of last year and was approved that zone change. This is just for a single family subdivision in the R1 9000 zone. The lots meet the standards as called out in the code. It's fairly straightforward, and we would recommend approval.
All right, thank you. Ben, any comments from engineering on this one?
No, again, this one's fairly straightforward. It's just a local road with the cul-de-sac. 300 is identified on our master plan as a larger road, and they are dedicating their side of the right-of-way to meet those standards and those requirements. We recommend approval.
All right, thank you. And just for the information of the commissioners, this is the one that we were considering a assisted living facility at one time several months ago when the residents came out against it. So this will put it into a subdivision instead. All right, this one also requires a hearing and open the meeting for public hearing at this time. We have received no public comments, so we'll close the public hearing. I need a motion first on the preliminary plan from someone, please.
Mr. Chairman, I moved that we approve the preliminary plan subject to the findings, conditions, and modifications found in the engineering report. This is Rod.
Rod, all right, thank you. We have a motion from Rod. Do I have a second?
Second from Chris.
Second from Chris, all right, thank you. Any further discussion on the preliminary plan? Hearing none, we'll take a roll call vote. Rod?
Aye.
Christine? Christine?
Aye. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just barely.
Oh,
Chris?
Aye.
Harold?
Aye.
And Ryan?
Aye.
Chairman votes aye also. It's unanimous. The motion passed. All right, we need a motion on the final plat for Peak Meadows Plat A. Need a motion from someone, please.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we recommend approval of the final plat with the findings listed in the staff report and subject to findings, conditions, and modifications found in the engineering report. This is Rod.
All right, Rod, we have a motion. Do I have a second, please?
Ryan, second.
Ryan,
Go ahead.
second. Any further discussion on the motion on the final plat for Peak Meadows, Plat A? Hearing none, we'll take a roll call vote. Christine?
aye.
Rod?
Aye.
Chris?
Aye.
Harold?
Aye.
And Ryan.
Aye.
And the chairman votes aye also. It is unanimous. It is passed. Moving right along. Hearing, review, and action on the amendments to section 17.5.131 of the American Fork City Municipal Code relating to water, pressurized irrigation, and sewer connection standards. Ben, I guess this was yours.
Yeah, so I'll lead. I just wanted to make sure if everyone received the email that I sent earlier today with an additional sub paragraph that we've added into it, as we realized that there may be some additional instances that weren't clarified with these clarifications. So we basically added, took what is described in 17.5.131A1 before you, and we took just a kind of that last sentence, created that as a sub paragraph of paragraph, and then added paragraph, added a second paragraph on it. So what I'd like, unless there's a better way, but I'll just go ahead and yeah, Vendeline's pulled it up, but I'll read what those changes were so that we can make sure include in the recommendation that these additional this additional subparagraph is also included with that. Basically, the intent of this code change was to clarify understanding of when buildings, whether it's all multi-building or owned by one person or owned individually, when you need to have a separate and distinct service lateral into the individual units versus the building as a whole, as well as a few other clarifications to ensure that all buildings and all units have the appropriate connections and services laterals that they need. And so that was a huge part what these changes and clarifications were on that. The specific one that we had added as far as the subparagraph, so this is section 17.5.131A1B, states in the instance of a multi-story, multi-unit building where property boundaries of each unit are confined to the extents of the structures and there are no exterior landscaping areas located within the unit's property boundaries, individual pressurized irrigation service lateral is not required. Basically, it's like a townhome. If you have a townhome that they just own the building itself, but they don't have any landscaping on their lot or anything like that, if we didn't have this clarification in there, it would be considered a dwelling unit that would need to have its own pressurized irrigation line. But if there's no irrigation or landscaping need, then there's no point in having it. So when you make your recommendation, if it is a recommendation of approval, just indicate that we recommendation of approval condition that the subparagraph section 17.5.131A1B is included. And I think that should be fine. Adam, correct me if I'm wrong on that, or would that be sufficient?
I think that's probably fine.
Okay, and I'm happy to answer or clarify any questions if anyone has any.
Any questions for Ben from the commission? This is a major housekeeping issue, basically, is what it comes down to. Any questions for engineering?
I had a question about, because this is calling out, what if somebody has their own water, say they have a well, for example, is this, because the way this reads, and maybe I'm wrong, but is it reading that each dwelling unit shall be served by the city's culinary water and pressurized irrigation system? So if somebody is not connected to the irrigation system and they're using a well ride or something like that, is this out of compliance for this code?
So there's a separate section in the code that kind of addresses that issue. Generally speaking, if it's already an existing building with an existing water use, for example, some of the projects down in the TOD area, there's a couple of existing homes, and in some of the subdivision plat approvals that you've had recently, what we're requiring the developer to do for these existing homes that are serviced by a septic tank and a well is that when they construct the road, they at least provide a lateral to these existing homes, but the existing owners are grandfathered and not required to make the connection. If where they have that existing service line there, generally speaking, like for example, when the septic tank will fail and they need to replace it and they were to go and get an approval, at that point, they would be required to connect on. So if it's an existing well or an existing septic system or any of that there in a separate section of code, they are grandfathered in and do not have to connect until some other condition requires them to make those adjustments in the future.
So how about for pressurized irrigation?
So pressurized irrigation would also be one that they would add a lateral to the connection, but until they have any sort of, like if they were to do a remodel or an addition onto their home that requires a planning commission approval, at that point, part of the condition would be you need to connect to this service lateral that is provided to your home. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm not sure I'm sold on the reasoning why, and maybe you could help me understand that.
So a lot of it usually just kind of boils down to when you have a particular existing use and we make a modification in the code, the existing uses are generally grandfathered in. I mean, in other sections in the code, you'll have something that may indicate, any existing homes, like for example, an annexation, or for water conveyance. For water conveyance, our water conveyance ordinance states that if it's an existing home that was already in the city, that has been in existence, it's grandfathered in and doesn't have to have additional water rights conveyed because it's grandfathered in because we did change after the existing use was already in place. And so that's wherein you're only going to see it if it's like an existing home that they're grandfathered in until they meet other requirements in the code that triggers some of the, okay, now you've got to connect onto the citywide system.
Any other questions?
I'm just sitting here thinking, if I'm doing a small remodel on my home that requires a permit, or I'm finishing my basement and it's a whatever, and I've got a well, and then all of a sudden I come in, that's a pretty significant addition. If I'm going to convert from a well to the city's irrigation line and connect to it, that's a pretty, I don't know. I'm still trying to understand that. Maybe I don't have my head around it. Maybe it's simpler.
I think perhaps there could be a change in condition, meaning, you change the use of your home or the demands. And at that point, the source, their existing source may not be adequate to continue to supply, what they're doing with their property at that point. And so when there's a change in condition, that would force a connection with the service.
Correct.
But is it conditioned upon a lack of ability, or it's conditioned upon you're finishing out your basement, and regardless of whether you have the ability, we're going to now require you to connect to the water line?
It could be a combination of both in my mind. Again, I don't mean to step on engineering here, but I guess my understanding is, again, it's a existing source based on existing demand. But once that changes, hooking on to ensure public safety or providing adequate sources, you have that confidence that it's going to be provided.
Correct.
We're not talking about we're talking about irrigation water, not fire. Are we going to be able to put a fire?
It's both, right? I mean, your indoor use, even with the basement, could increase that the well no longer has the ability to adequately provide that amount of water.
Well, but Ben said that it's if something requires planning commission approval. A finishing of a basement doesn't require planning commission approval. So that wouldn't be a requirement to force them to do that. Is that correct, Ben? Is that the way I understood that?
And that would be the case. For example, one of the prime ones, and Planning Commission has had a few similar projects like this for, for example, there was a barn that was proposed, maybe 6-9 months ago or something like that. That barn was proposed by the resident that is currently on a well and on sewer and so forth, or on a septic system and not connected to our city. Because of the size, it had to come before Planning Commission to get approval. One of the items in the code indicates that the minimum level requirements or making those connections may be required if there's a significant enough change in that use. And if it isn't significant enough, then they don't have to connect. There may be instances where you're correct. I mean, maybe you're doing a basement remodel, and that one I may not be as familiar with, where it's more specific with building and we don't deal with anything on the engineering side. I don't know if there's a specific trigger mechanism for just a building permit that may not necessarily go to Planning Commission that would also require them to make the connection. There may be some verbiage in there as far as when you're allowed to issue a building permit. Some of the other things that we tend to look at is, for example, there was a lot, I think it was kind of up by the Temple area, off of 7th North. There was a little cul-de-sac there. At time that the city's pressurized irrigation system was installed, that particular property owner did not to provide a lateral into the system. Now they've come in for a building permit to build their house, and they didn't have a pressurized irrigation lateral. In order for us to sign off issuing the building permit, they have to go and install that lateral and connect on, because you had a significant enough change in that use to trigger the requirement of, okay, you now have to connect onto the system. So there are some instances where it does create that trigger, and other instances where it may not reach that threshold and they wouldn't be required to make that connection if they don't meet those requirements.
I guess I'm thinking maybe more along the lines of irrigation specifically, but if that individual that you're talking about that came in for, what if they had water shares that allowed them to irrigate their property and they still didn't want to connect to the pressurized irrigation?
Yeah, and there may be instances, right? And there may be instances that they still have a water right, but let's say it triggers something. Then let's say that they don't have a PI lateral onto their actual lot. We may require them to install that lateral, but they still may be and even though they tie in, if they have a water source through, American Fork Irrigation Company or otherwise that irrigates that, our code doesn't allow us to rescind that water right. They can still have that water right. But if they were to remodel or something like that, some of those triggers, we may start to at least have that connection, but we can't. The irrigated water is a little bit trickier in that we can't overstep our boundaries and say, no, you don't have a water right anymore by virtue of this connection. They can still use that water right, but we may still require them to at least run a lateral in their property so that it's there and available.
Is there not a provision? I thought there was a provision that allowed, if they had water right, that they could continue to own and use their water right, hook onto the irrigation system, and then, almost like allow use of that water right for a reduced rate on the system. And basically they get water and they use the water right to offset the cost of that.
Correct. And there is that provision that if they have an existing water right, they can have a reduced monthly fee for the secondary because they're using their other water source. And they work with that with utility billing. And so we do allow for those accommodations when they have those existing water shares.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that, and that is a part of it that I want to make sure that we're obviously, but at the same time, to force somebody to connect to a system and then have increases and stuff on a system that they are not interested in using and aren't required. Again, if it's water culinary water or something like that. But if I have a ditch that I have irrigating rights for, and it's flood irrigating my backyard or something, or whatever the circumstance is, I'm a little concerned that we're prescribing somebody, you have to connect to this, or again, I guess stub in, and then if they put in the lateral, are there monthly expenses that are associated with that, or as the system goes, I'm a little, I would want to make sure that we're not forcing somebody out of their ability to use a water right.
Right. And no, we wouldn't be forcing them to do that. The only time that they would be required to do that is again, if they want to completely tear down their house and rebuild another one, and then we may require the lateral to be run taut, but we can't say, okay, this water right you can't use this water right anymore. This ordinance doesn't require that, and there's other instances where they would be protected and again grandfathered in to still utilize it. The closest one, as far as the culinary and the PI, those ones are ones that are a lot easier to, if they have a groundwater well right and irrigation water right or whatnot that irrigates their land, those ones will remain the way that they are. The one that is the only one that really could force someone, that I would say, is more the sewer connection. And if they're on a septic tank right now and their septic tank fails and they want to put in a new septic system, our code doesn't allow that. And at that point, they would be forced to connect onto the sewer line. But generally speaking, the PI line and the culinary line are not ones that, until they give up those water rights themselves, we don't have the authority to overstep that and say you can't use that anymore. We may require the lateral to be run to the site, but it may just not be used. And until they trigger, so the building department, when they do a building permit fee, there's connection fees if they're going to connect onto the system. If they don't, let's say we require the lateral to be run, but they choose not to connect onto it, my understanding is they wouldn't be charged that connection fee and they wouldn't be billed a monthly billing unless they actually make that connection, at which point they would be required to that.
Perfect.
So
Thank
it leaves it up in their hands to be able to still control when they use their existing water rights versus, even though we may require a lateral connection, it doesn't force them to use it necessarily.
Any other questions or comments? This one also requires a public hearing. We haven't received any comments, so we'll open the public hearing for this subject and close the hearing at the same time. Need a motion on the amendments for the section 17.5.131. Be sure and include the A1B paragraph. Whoever makes the motion, try to pass it.
Mr. Chairman, this is Chris. I move that we recommend approval of the code text amendment.
To include the new paragraph that Ben brought forward also?
Yeah, to include 1A, 1B, I think is what it was.
Right, 131A1B. All right, we have a motion from Chris. Do I have a second?
This is Rod. I'll second it.
I have a second from Rod. Any further discussion on this item? Hearing none, we'll take a roll call vote. Christine?
Aye.
Rod?
Aye.
Chris?
Aye.
Harold?
Yeah, aye.
Ryan?
Aye.
And Chairman votes aye also. It passes unanimously. We're down to other business. Anybody have any other business this time for the meeting? If not, we'll move on to site plan committee report. Ben Lee?
You guys get ready? I'm almost done.
So this is the upcoming agenda. It's relatively short again. There are two items that are concerning the same property at 280 North County Boulevard. It's currently a home. The applicant is proposing to change the zoning to professional office, and with that also the land use. Then the third item is a code text amendment, which we already discussed at the last meeting regarding off-street parking standards.
All right, thank you, Vendeline.
Welcome.
Moving on, review and action on the minutes of the May 20th, 2020 Planning Commission regular session. I found one correction need to be done on page 3, line 26. It should state 2.25, not 2.5, as is listed in the minutes. 2.25 should be there. Anybody have anything else for minutes? If not, we'll take a roll call vote on the minutes from the May 20th meeting. Christine?
Aye.
Rod?
I missed the meeting last time, so I'll abstain.
Okay, abstain. Chris?
Aye.
Harold?
Aye.
Ryan?
Aye.
And Chairman votes aye also, so it passed with that one correction I had in there. All right, we're down to the big one. Anybody want a motion for adjournment?
Ryan, move to adjourn.
All right, we have a motion from Ryan. Do we have a second?
Second from Chris.
Second from Chris. We are adjourned. All right, thank you much, folks. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you all.
Take care, guys.
All right.
You.
Night.